Welcome to Beyond the Message, the weekly podcast where we break down the weekend teaching at Christ Community Chapel. We go a little bit deeper. We apply it to our lives. My name is Jimmy Cozy. I'm part of the staff here. If you did not see the sermon this week, it's linked in the episode description below. So just scroll on down there and click it and watch the sermon, listen to the sermon, then come back. We'll be right here waiting for you. But I'm here with my friends and some of our ministry leaders here at CCC. And to start, I want you to introduce yourselves. I need you to pull out your phone. Okay, so we're going to have a moment of honesty and great courage. And what I'd like you to do is simply to share the last thing that was playing through your phone into your headphones and tell us about it. So go ahead.
You don't have to play this game?
No.
All right.
Well, I'll play too.
My name is Brooks Montgomery. I'm the men's ministry team here. The last song I was playing in was called a little instrumental, lo-fi, called Brazil Roots.
Is that a coffee roast or is that a song?
I couldn't tell. I'm not a huge...
Little of this, little of that.
The band is Nebula Waves. I think this is the first time I've heard them. They were just on a playlist, but...
it's their version of that.
It was a calming commute into work.
Yeah. There could be a game that we could play. Is it the name of a beer, a craft beer, the name of a coffee roast, or some music that Brooks is listening to?
Yeah.
Or all the above.
All the above. Okay. I'm Sarah, Kids and Students Director. And the last thing I was listening to was the Big Boo cast.
The what? Sorry, say that again.
Are we allowed to say that on this podcast?
Yes.
This podcast we're going to get a rating now.
Yeah, you guys, it's good. It's fun.
Uh-huh.
It's two women.
What is
Can
it?
you tell us about it?
I feel like
It's fun is not very descriptive.
It's like a super random podcast, right?
Okay.
Of like two Southern women who are just talking about anything and everything.
So what's the episode about that you were listening to?
They were talking
nothing.
about, they're really into college sports. And in the South, I think that's super common.
Yeah.
So they were talking about the college baseball finals.
Oh, okay.
And then they both have kids who are in college or have graduated. So they were talking about that. The one, Big Mama, her husband is really into fishing.
Be serious.
And so he was talking about the tilapia he caught.
Okay.
What a morning.
That's phenomenal.
Guys, this is what I need to do.
My name's Jamie Hewitt, and I guess I'm all in on Christ Community Chapel because the last thing I was listening to was Wake Up, Look Up,
Wow.
which is
You win.
the podcast.
Congratulations.
Zach Wyrock.
Congratulations, Jamie.
I
Well done.
am that guy.
My last thing was I had a Y2K pop playlist going. The song was Genie in a Bottle by Christina Aguilera.
Can I see that? Is that real?
Yeah, that's legit.
I have
right
a hard
there.
time putting you
Look,
and Christina together.
I'm a man of
X-Tina
wide
is what we
interests.
call her when
Yeah,
we're fans.
That's right. Wait, hold on a
We
second.
call her X-Tina when
Okay.
we're fans.
Let's get into the podcast
Yep.
now.
On that note.
Well, this week's sermon, Promises Made, Promises Kept, comes from Genesis chapter 15. A lot of interesting stuff going on. There's animals being cut in half. Stars are out. If you remember, Pastor Joe took us through 3 points. It was all about Abram. It was all about doubt. And he started, his first point was Abram and doubt. And so at that point in the sermon and in the passage, Abram is looking to God saying, how do I know that you're going to come through on the promises that you've made to me? And then how do I know I'm going to get what you actually said I'm going to get? So kind of this two-pronged approach to doubt. And then Pastor Joe talked about God and doubt. And so he kind of shared a few things. He shared, first of all, how God responded to Abram in his doubt, which I think is a really powerful moment. God pulls Abram, says, hey, we're going to go out, look at the stars. Your offspring are going to outnumber these stars. Just this incredible moment of awe. And then there's this really peculiar scene where they cut a covenant, which is the terminology they would have used in the ancient world. But he tells Abram to go get a whole bunch of different animals, and they literally saw them in half. And then God passes through the visual representation of God passes through the dead animals as a representation that, the idea behind it was, this is what will happen to me if I don't hold up my end of the bargain. And really important to note that only God was the only one who passed through, saying that he is going to hold up his end of the bargain. And in that way, one of the things Pastor Joe said was that when you're experiencing doubt, two things you can do. The first is to look up and see what God has done, to look up and experience awe. And then the second is to look back at what God has done. And then he talked about you and doubt. And so the idea there was us thinking and finding ways to look back, ultimately looking to look up and to look back, ultimately looking to Jesus as the answer to our doubt. So I want to start with this. Maybe for you, what was kind of the moment that stuck out the most to you, the takeaway that you took when you heard this sermon?
Yeah, I think for me is thinking about the very real moments or feelings of doubt always need to be lived in the reality that Christ has walked through, that he has poured out his blood. I think it's easy when I start to doubt, and in little ways, big ways, whatever that may look like, which I'm sure we'll get to in just a minute, I get blinders immediately, start to zoom in only on my doubt, disconnect it completely to what God has done, to what Christ has done. And just even for me, recognizing that every single time I have a doubt, it's got to be lived in the reality of what Christ has done, not disconnected from that.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that it was just good that I think Pastor Joe talked about that doubt is normal. Yeah. Kind of normalize that it's not unusual. And I really liked when you talked about how doubt and faith are cousins.
That was really interesting.
I thought that was really good because I think we tend to think, oh, if we doubt, that's a bad thing.
We think of them as opposition to each other, that you're either faithful or you're doubting, but it can't be both.
Yeah. So I thought that was really good that he mentioned a quote that he couldn't find. So I don't know if it's actually
that might not even be real.
Right.
Yeah.
But
that's always my move when I read it.
Yeah, exactly.
I heard a quote.
Right. But it was interesting. It was this idea of like, hey, more doubt actually allows you to be more faithful or trusting to God. And I don't know if I've ever connected those two, but he did a good job of explaining that. So I thought that was a good takeaway. Yeah.
And takeaways similarly was God's patience with Abram in the midst of Abram's doubt. And then just at a really high level, I think God does not ask us to trust and follow blindly, but he's a God who wants to point us towards the evidence for why we can and should put our trust into him, even in the midst of doubt.
Yeah, I think for me, there was one moment where I felt like was the most powerful to me. I actually got goosebumps a little bit when Pastor Joe was talking about, he was talking about how God responded to Abram's doubt. And I actually like to watch that clip together.
That's what Abram does to God. He says, God, how do I know that you're going to come through with your promise? I'm doubting you. And this is what God does. He is so kind. It says this in verse 5. He brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. You can almost see God putting his arm around Abram. After Abraham calls him into doubt, into question. Sometimes people think that God gets frustrated with us when we doubt. I don't think that's true. He doesn't do it with Abram. He puts his arm around Abram, takes him outside and says, look up. There are a few things that fill me with more awe than a cloudless night where the stars are just exploding in the sky.
Yeah, so I thought that was just really impactful for me to see the way that, I think that we would expect God to respond differently. Maybe I'll say it this way. I know how I would respond if somebody was doubting me, and it would not be like that.
You're not alone.
Well, have you ever done that like with your kids?
Oh, yeah.
Right? Whether it's like you've proven your record with your kids. Like, hey, I'm always going to come through for you. I'm here for you. I've never not done that for you. And then they question it, in some silly circumstance. You're like,
yeah. And my instinct is not to put my arm around them.
Yeah.
It's to be like, hey, do you want to eat
go
tonight?
out and
Get in the car.
Like, yeah.
Are we going to have dinner tonight? It's like, have I ever not fed you?
Yes.
Yeah,
one day in your whole life.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that's like you zoom in at oftentimes it's easy to look at stories. This is throughout the whole Old Testament. So zoom in on stories of people who are doubting, of people who are perhaps failing, and you're thinking, what are you guys doing? How could you be so foolish? How could you have such small faith? And you almost forget to look at what God is doing. Such patience, such grace, right? And this is ultimately, I think, this is not a story about Abram's doubt as much as it is about God's response to people who are doubting him.
His consistent and his faithful reminder and his steadfastness. And I really thought Pastor Joe put it well. He is so kind to Abram because he could have been, he would be well within his rights in that moment to be like, Abram, what else do I need to do for you in order to prove myself to you? But instead of doing that, he just says, let's go outside and look at the stars. This is your offspring. Here, let's cut some animals in half. Let me show you what I'm going to do. So I was curious to hear from you. Pastor Joe talked about kind of those two kinds of doubt that we experience. The first is doubting God himself, like whether he can make good on his promise to us, whether he's capable of it. And then the second is doubting ourselves. So doubting whether we are, quote unquote, good enough to receive. And I'm curious to hear from you, which one of those maybe resonated more, and how have you seen that or experienced that in your life?
Yeah, for me, it's definitely, I don't tend to doubt God as much as I tend to doubt myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's probably just because I'm so self-aware of my shortcomings. And in the areas that I fail, it's almost flabbergasting to think about, oh, God can he'll even use me in part of that plan, or I won't mess it up somehow because I'm sinful human being and I tend to do that a lot. So I think that was, I don't know, just a good thing for me to remind myself that, especially in this story, it was solely on God.
Yeah.
To keep that promise. He made it, he kept it.
He made that clear.
And he had nothing to do with Abram. And I think that's probably very true in my own life as well. I almost give myself too much credit.
Yeah. Like that
I'm
you
the
could
one
move
who
the needle.
could, yes.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's true.
I feel like I would go, at least personally, perhaps the other way.
Really?
And it just goes to show how how horribly selfish my view of the Christian life is, because this is the reason I feel like the friction exists, is when myself or others I know who are doing the right things and they're experiencing pain. That's the moment where I say, God, do you not see that, I am, or people I know are living righteously?
We've done it all. Yeah.
They're being obedient to you, and yet this is the situation that's in their family. Even a small reason, like if I remember a family member got sick on vacation one time, right? Yeah. I was like, man, God, like they've been so faithful, obedient. They just need rest. Like, what's going on here? Like, and in big moments. So I think that's the friction of when things are not going well, when someone is doing well, which just goes to show that's not the story. It's not the the idea of the Christian life, but it is a temptation that often leads me to doubt God.
Yeah, I was thinking about the tension between those two different types of doubt, and I lean more towards doubting God. And even when I think about doubting myself, I'm like, I should. The reality
I
is
should doubt myself a little more.
Is I honestly, like, time and time again, I don't measure up. I don't deserve this. I have fallen. And I think actually that's actually the beautiful hope that we see in Abram, is that we have no reason to doubt God, though we have every reason to doubt ourselves.
I wonder if some of that is sometimes, the way I thought about this when I was thinking was that it might be connected to the spiritual environment that you grew up in too. Like for me, I grew up in a relatively conservative church environment where the holiness of God was really, really stressed. So I never, I never doubted that God could come through, but I think I could doubt myself being really good enough, or thinking that like if I sin, then somehow God's going to punish me for it, or that bad things that are happening because of sin that I have in my life.
No, that's really interesting. I think that's probably very similar to how, because I had, a great home Christian family. And I remember my dad always talking about the awesomeness of who God is. And it was so easy for me to understand that, and to, like, especially in ways he would point it out in our lives, or, through the scripture. And so I think you're right. Like that does very much shape how you see it.
If you grew up in an environment where it's very grace emphasis, where you might be saying, well, God, where's all this grace? Like you're saying, Brooks, of saying, we're on vacation, that person's getting sick. They've done everything right. Why would you let them get sick?
That doesn't make sense.
Where's your grace right now? I could use some of it in this moment. That's interesting. I think another thing I was curious to hear from you about is one of two directions. Number one, if you're willing to share about a time in your own life where you've experienced doubt, and how you felt like God interacted and showed up in that. Or also, I think one of the other things that is probably true for people listening to this podcast or watching it is that it's not so much their doubt they're concerned about, but it's the doubt of somebody close to them. I think that's one of the things that when I was doing student ministry here, one of the most common conversations I would have with a parent is a parent coming to me saying, my son or daughter is thinking about walking away from Christianity. And so I guess my question is, either do you have a story of your own time, or how would you counsel somebody who comes to you with that issue?
Yeah, at least personally, I the moments of doubt have often come from people whose faith has seemed like it was on shambles. So, I mean, I think all of us could imagine, whether it's personally those we know who have said, hey, I am a Christian, I'm living in obedience to Jesus Christ, and you realize behind the veil their life is a complete lie. Or people high profile. I mean, all of us think we kind of live in an era and an age, sadly, where a lot of high profile people that profess faith in Jesus, it appears that they've fallen away from that, right? And I think that moment, and a lot of people, it seems like even my generation, a lot of people don't have necessarily doubts in the person of Jesus. They have doubts in people who claim to follow Jesus,
so
and their
like
life is a lie.
A high-profile Christian has a major falling out. They're like, well, where was God? It's like they've built their faith on their reverence for that person rather than their reverence for Jesus himself.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why it's even just through experiences like that, even personally, it's kind of locating, where is your faith built? Is it built on the resume that looking back, looking up what God has, provided? Or is my faith almost associated with someone? And when that someone fails, all of a sudden doubts compound.
Which is interesting. I think that's part of what Joe was saying last night is when you look at stories like this or the life of Abraham as a whole, you don't look to Abram. You look to Jesus. And in the same way, what you're describing, where somebody might say, well, I saw this prominent speaker and he, this happened in his life. So that must mean the whole thing is a sham. And what I think we should do, what Pastor Joe would have said is, actually you need to evaluate Christianity through the merits of Jesus and what he's done, not through somebody who is not him, their attempt to follow Jesus and ultimate struggle with sin.
I think not the only time, that's not true, but one of the times that has really impacted me and I can remember is when I've had someone who's really close to me, who's really struggling with making a choice to either follow God or not, right? And so that might be in a lifestyle choice or it's usually, a step of obedience or not, but it's someone who's really close to me who I love so dearly, but I see so much pain and suffering in that person who's choosing that. And I remember distinctly thinking, man, I hope what I believe is true, because this might break a relationship with this person.
Yeah.
And that is extremely painful.
Yeah.
Especially because that, what does that look like? What does that, what does that mean for
I hope this is worth it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think the reality, we could all probably describe a time in our life with that. And that is really hard when it's not, it could be a family member, who's that you love and care for. That's a time that I remember really struggling and going, wait, is what I believe actually true?
Yeah.
When
the rubber hits the road,
compromise on
this? This could cost me in relationships,
Yeah.
but there's also a number of other ways that it could cost you, whether it's professionally in other personal ways. Yeah, I think there's a ton of ways, and that's when it gets real.
Yeah, I think as I was thinking back on the sermon, Pastor Joe will say, look up, look back, look to Jesus. Another place I was thinking of just looking at the alternative. I don't know, as you were talking and you're like, hey, I hope this is worth it. I remember having a moment when I was 19 or 20 and I'd been following Jesus for 3 years and hit a season of doubt. And one of the things in the midst of that was asking a very similar question. Man, I hope that this is true. And then stopping a minute and being like, what do I have if it's not?
Yeah. Or the alternative.
And the answer was nothing.
Yeah.
Like there was hopelessness, despair.
That's right.
And then that directed me to say, okay, I'm gonna relook at this and I'm gonna look at Jesus again. That helped me direct my eyes back. So I had that existential moment. Another that I was thinking of, like maybe a little bit more real life and practical as a follower of Jesus. I went on staff with a ministry and right a couple years out of college. And as I had been on staff with that ministry, which a lot of ministry jobs, they're not known for, crazy high salaries.
What?
I know, this might be surprising, but I remember sitting, and Carolyn, my wife, and I, we had been married for less than 6 months. And I remember sitting in the living room of a family we were staying with because we couldn't get an apartment at that time. And both of us looking, at our finances, and we were just crying and praying together. And we happened to be reading through the Gospel of Mark. And there's a passage in Mark 8 where the disciples are in a boat with Jesus, and it mentions they didn't have any bread. And Jesus says, hey, do you remember what just happened when, we fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves, and how many baskets were left over? And they say 7. And then Jesus is like, and when we fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread, and how many baskets were left over? And they say 12. And he's like, don't you get it?
Mhm.
Like, can't you look back and see what I've
Kinda like
done?
Yeah.
And so I remember being in that living room as Carolyn and I were doubting whether God was going to show up, whether we were going to have money for a car payment or to get an apartment or whatever it was. And in this real moment where we felt that, and we looked back and we remembered how in the process of fundraising to go on staff, like God had met every single need that we had. We were $5 short of a $20,000 goal. And without asking, I get teary thinking about this. Like a high school kid is like, hey, here's a $5 bill. And like we sat there in that moment in the living room and we're just like, man, God has shown up. Like but it was so easy to forget that in that moment unless we looked back at it.
And that reminds me of, kind of what Pastor Joe said, that you need to find ways to look up and find ways to look back. So what are, I think that's a really great example of something that you can look back on for all of us. What are ways that you do either of those things? You practice them in your life?
Mhm.
I almost look up. In my mind, it's like to look around. Like part of the beautiful thing about being in a church, being in the life of a church, is the same way Abram looks up and sees stars and sees God's awe, what he's doing in creation. It's like look around to see, people in our church are in a way those exact, awe moments that God has created. Stories of guys who are fighting sin, stories of kids who are getting baptized, of families who are experiencing restoration in their marriage that never dreamt possible.
Yeah.
Like those are moments of looking around and seeing there are stars like literally surrounding us as we're worshiping God and
It's like what
hearing
the
those
book
stories.
of Hebrews says about the cloud of witnesses that are around.
Yep. Yeah, it's like those are some of the most affirming moments that God is moving powerfully amidst all of us in the life of our church, even if right now it feels like there's moments of doubt in your own story with him.
For me, this might seem really obvious, but I think it's worth mentioning is that I do think you need to be spending time in the Word.
Mm-hmm.
The Scripture is full of stories where God showed up.
Yeah.
Over and over again. And I specifically think the Old Testament, though a lot of times we tend to start with the New Testament because it's easier to read or whatever. The Old Testament, it is just filled. The Israelites would continue to leave God, disobey God.
We're just getting started. We're just getting started.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, exactly. Genesis is just the
Even
beginning.
with Abraham, we're just getting started.
Yes.
He's got more
Well, and I
stuff
think it's
coming.
really cool that the other verse that Pastor Joe brings up after he talks about taking out Abraham and seeing the stars, he goes, hey, Abraham, remember and the Chaldeans and what I did there? Yeah. So it's just this constant, the Old Testament is just a constant reminder how God continues to show up and be there. And so that's the stuff like, hey, maybe it's Hebrews where it talks about God's the same today, yesterday and forever. It's like, okay, so the same God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament today.
Yeah,
today.
You might say that seems obvious, but sometimes there's a reason something's obvious. It's because God has revealed himself to us in Scripture and spoken clearly. And, I think if you've ever wondered what God has to say to you or about you, that's the first place you need to look.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I think a verse from the Old Testament that has always stood out to me is in Deuteronomy 6 and 8. And it's a little bit of a different context. God is warning them to remember when things are really good, but I think it still applies. But he'll say, take care lest you forget. And so there's an intentionality that comes, like you and I are prone to forget.
Yeah.
God thankfully recognizes that and meets us in that
space. He preloaded. He was ready for that.
Yeah. He's like, hey, you're going to forget this. Be intentional. So I think that having rhythms that help us to remember are necessary for us because left to ourselves, we are inclined to forget.
That's right.
So we are not people who look back on our own. We are not people who look up on our own. We're not people who tend to look to Jesus on our own. And so setting rhythms for yourself and structure in your life, and maybe you say, I'm going to pray or journal, and I'm going to list out 5 things that I'm thankful for and grateful for that God did today or this week, whatever that rhythm might look like for you, but be intentional with it.
it just made me think. I remember there was a study that was sort of asking, hey, for Christians who doubt, what are the 2 things that they stop doing first? First was they stopped going to church, and second is they stopped reading scripture.
So they disengage from community and they disengage from God's
the
primary
clearest places where they would
them.
see what they need to see.
And I mean, I think all of us could say, moments of doubt, those are temptations for probably all of us to engage in. But I think you're exactly right. You're by default, you're going to stop remembering, right? And I think that's what it's, the kind of standing firm in doubt at a fork in the road to say, hey, I'm actually going to lean into the church community. I'm going to lean into scripture. Because naturally we're not going to do that.
And we see God's gracefulness, his patience, his goodness to Abram in the midst of that, meeting him in there and offering his presence. He says, I'm not walking away from you. I'm not turning away. I'm not giving up, but I'm going to lean in and I'm going to remind you of why you can trust me.
All right, let's wrap by the same way we do each week. So each of you share one challenge to the listeners or viewers of this podcast as they, apply this sermon to their lives.
I kind of feel like we already did that.
Well,
maybe
I have to do it anyway.
I mean, I think the first thing, and maybe I'll let other people speak more practically, don't let your doubt count you out.
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing. Abram doesn't walk away. He doesn't doubt and then just run. So a little bit of what Brooks was talking about. I think our tendency can be to run. So first, don't take yourself out of the game because of your doubt. And maybe I'll let you guys throw out some.
Well, I think just you hearing you say that, I think it's like, it's okay to go to God and say, I'm unsure of this. I don't know what's going on. Like, don't be afraid to bring your doubts to God. It's okay to sit in that and wait to hear on God in that. I think a lot of us do feel like we have to, I don't know, create this facade of like, hey, we have it all together and I'm not doubting God. But the fact is, we've all just said doubt is a normal part of life and our faith. And so just bringing those to God and saying, yeah, I'm really confused. And maybe like you even said, like write those things down so that then later you can go back and say, oh, look what God did and how he answered that, or how he showed me the truth in his word that combats that doubt.
Yeah, this is not to question God as all knowing, because he is. Like, had Abram not voiced that, had he just felt it and then stuffed it down and said, I shouldn't think that, like he would have missed out on God's assurance to him.
That's exactly, I mean, that's an excellent question to be thinking about, because I think oftentimes we do not voice our doubts to God for a myriad of reasons, right? We think, it's God's going to be ticked off at us. This isn't big enough of an issue to bring to God. Ultimately, we're missing out on an expansion of our ability to place faith and experience God's grace, right? And so I think even just the freedom and liberty to being honest with your doubts will expand your capacity to experience a God who is faithful to you, who is near to you. And just like Abram, as we see, who makes a covenant, is faithful to the end, has done that in Christ. Like, dishonesty with your doubts does not really produce an increased faith in your life.
Yeah. And I would add 2 things. I think the first is not only to be honest with God with your doubts, but also to talk to others about it. I think that's part of the beauty of community. So if you're experiencing doubt, to engage, that's why the church exists. Then the other is, if you're going to judge Christianity, do it on the merits of Jesus and not on anything else. Thanks for listening to Beyond the Message. Each week, episodes drop on Monday afternoons. You can find them on Spotify. You can find them in the CCC app. You can find them on Apple Podcasts. All kinds of other content's available on our app as well. So make sure you check that out, and we will see you next week.